I wanted to talk to you today about this book, Against Techno-Ableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement by Ashley Hsu. This book is at the intersection of technology and disability studies. And I think that disability studies is a crucial cutting-edge area of critical theory that is helpful for any of us in the social sciences. Disability is something that is important and affects everyone because in critical disability studies, basically they are putting a critical lens to the concept of ability, disability, who is defined as the norm and who's defined as outside of that norm, especially when it comes to our built environment. Because of course we can build the environment to accommodate any body. And so which bodies do we centralize and say this accommodation is enough and that doesn't need to happen for those bodies. So I use this book in some of my sociology courses. For example, I teach a class called Sociology of the Body, where we critically examine the embodied nature of sociological issues and problems within society. This is a great book for thinking about race and ethnicity at the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and disability. Thinking about bodies, of course, disabled bodies are not just white, but are representative of all races. And so at the intersection of thinking about race and disability, what can we learn from those two perspectives? Disability is an issue, of course, that can come to affect any body in our society in a myriad of ways. And indeed, within the United States, about 20% of the population is officially defined as disabled. And bodies can become disabled in a variety of ways, become not disabled, and so it could be a temporary state, it could be a permanent state, and so it's definitely a state that any body could come to be in, and so that is also why it's important for us as sociologists to consider this particular embodied social position. We also just want to keep disability at the center of analysis for whatever social problem we're talking about. So if we're talking about policy, if we're talking about the educational institution, how is disability embedded within these institutional structures, within these interpersonal interactions in society, and indeed the built environment? So Ashley Hsu is an interdisciplinary researcher, and she's earned degrees in philosophy, science and technology studies, and even focused some of her research on the intersections of animal studies. She's earned 3 graduate degrees from Virginia Tech, and she also continued on with her academic career at the same institution. So her areas of research include bioethics, applied ethics, animal studies, animal ethics, history of technology, philosophy of science, and disability studies. But today we're going to focus just on her book, Against Techno-Ableism, Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. And this is a very small set of essays written about critical disability studies. Each essay is its own little story, so there's no need to read the book linearly, but each is a standalone piece. So what does critical disability studies mean? So think about critical race theory or feminist theory. These theories are challenging who is placed at the center of analysis and attempting to place a different body or bodies in the center of analysis to reflect back a critical perspective on society from a different perspective so that we can see the blind spots, so we can understand our society and our environment from multiple perspectives. Within critical disability studies, then, we can use the concept of disability in all its vast outcomes and possibilities to understand and critique how we build and maintain our society, both the physical environment, the interpersonal relationships, our relationship with the natural world, and so on. Chapter 1 is called Disabled Everything. And she opens with the sentence that says, "Let's start the way you expect a good disabled memoir or crip story to start, either with my horrible birth or my grave, brave injury." So she talks about how when the able-bodied person is looking upon the disabled-bodied person, that there's this question that the able-bodied person feels that they can question the disabled body and how it came to be. And so the disabled person has then learned that there's supposed to be some kind of apology and narrative to excuse their current embodied status, that they have to explain themselves. She says on the second page, disabled people are often asked to curate their stories, to front load their dramatic origins. I don't begrudge those who start this way. So in the entry point, when the disabled body and the able-bodied people interact, a part of the ableist behavior is to question that body and to say, explain yourself. And so I think about, in critical race theory, in race, being a mixed race person, there's always a question, especially if you look racially ambiguous, of like, what are you? What is your race? Even when it doesn't pertain to the situation, you're in line at the grocery store. And so it's the same situation here, that people can be so blatant and offensive in their questioning of the disabled body in public when it is not relevant to the conversation at hand. She says on page 4, this is a book about the stories that disabled people tell that non-disabled people usually aren't interested in. I am a disabled person who uses various technologies. Instead, I intend to take seriously the experiences of disabled people in a world that often considers technology the solution to the problem of disability. So that's the center thesis of this book and this essay right here, is that what stories would disabled people choose to talk about themselves when it's not coming from that perspective of this ableist questioning? And also how technology is forced upon disability as this solution, when the question itself should come from the disability community of what technologies and assistance do they want and what do they not want, and to not have these technologies pushed upon someone unnecessarily or undesiring. This book is written in a very engaging conversational manner. She's talking about her own perspective, her own situation, and that of her friends, and using these stories to illustrate social policy problems. In this introduction, still on page 7, she talks about how she coined the term techno-ableism to describe a pattern disabled people see over and over, and a pattern observed by many others too. Techno-ableism is a particular type of ableism, one that is highly visible in media and entertainment and omnipresent in the way most people casually talk about technology aimed at disability. Techno-ableism is a belief in the power of technology that considers the elimination of disability a good thing, something we should strive for. It's a classic form of ableism, biased against disabled people, bias in favor of non-disabled ways of life. Techno-ableism is the use of technologies to reassert those biases, often under the guise of empowerment. So think about the example of the deaf community having hearing aids pushed upon them, when the deaf community also wants to celebrate their own community and does not always desire these technological interventions, but might want to have space and distance from the imposition of such technologies to make them always accessible and relatable to the able-bodied perspective. She's also introducing in this first essay that she considers disabled people the experts about disability, and she's no longer interested in what so-called experts have to say. And when we think about the sociology and history of the medical industrial complex and understand how the medical establishment has been really complicit in causing harms to disabled bodies and to the disability community, we can understand this desire to get away from these so-called medical experts that reinforce these ableist notions, and indeed are part of the institution that mediate those applications and financially benefit from it. In the first chapter then, she's introducing us to these kinds of establishing concepts that we can understand as we go through the rest of the essays. Chapter 2 is called Disorientation. She starts the chapter on the first 2 pages of attending the Amputee Coalition of America meetings and conference, the world in which we enter into. So first of all, among amputees, there's a hierarchy between those who've lost arms versus legs, whether it's above the knee, below the knee, at the hip. And all these booths and businesses and vendors that are there to sell every product imaginable for amputee assistive devices. And she says, of course, within the amputee coalition, people are not perfect and they still have internalized a great deal of ableist thought and hierarchy. There's also divisions within the community, like any subculture in any community, in which there's a divide between people who aren't interested in wearing prosthetics and those who are interested in such devices. And then, of course, just the material world and practicality. She states that her last leg cost $13,000, which was covered by insurance. And so she talked about her friend Mallory, who would need a prosthetic that begins at the hip, and such a device would cost over $100,000. So just how the price, the particular disability, and the particular technological prosthetic device and each associated cost provides an entire other scaffolding of barriers and inaccessibility. Does the insurance, what is the original cost? Does the insurance cover it? How useful is the device? Is it even the device that is wanted by the person? She says, but her friend Mallory, instead of getting this prosthetic device, uses both a wheelchair and a pair of forearm crutches, and Mallory, calls herself transmobile, stating in her universe there's no one perfect technology, so she has a whole array of technologies she can use in different situations and to fit different needs. She has more choices than most people about how she moves in the world. She has shown me that being disabled gives us more choice than non-disabled people have. It's a generative thought, and one rarely voiced outside of our community. And so one of the disorientations of this chapter is to really show us that disabled people are the experts about disability and technology, that the medical so-called experts should not be the centered voice of analysis, and also that just that ableist ideas of that the disabled body needs to have technologies and assistance to bring it up to these standards of the ableist body so that it performs in a comparable manner. And we want to make room for counter narratives. That includes people with disabilities who have no interest in being fixed or having these technological devices that make them closer towards this ableist ideal. She's talking about how ableism is reflected in such things as being deeply entrenched in language, in how we talk about disability, and even the ableist terms that are embedded within our language that shows the stigma associated with particular disabilities. Ableism, of course, is written into the law. The laws decide how the physical world is constructed and how this world will interact with different types of bodies, able bodies, disabled bodies, and which particular disabled bodies, as of course that's an entire spectrum of different situations. And so in this chapter, Disorientation, she's trying to show us the process of understanding how ableist assumptions have been embedded in all aspects of our culture, from the language to the law to each institution and to our own perspective of having that able-bodied narrative at the center of every analysis. And so she talks about on page 19 that how she applies this disorientation, then this concept of understanding that all structures within our society are reinforcing these ableist norms. And then she teaches a class about technology and disabilities, and she tells her students, my class is biased, but in the opposite way from most of their other trainings. Many of my students are in training for the health professions, engineering, or science. In my class, disabled people are the expert about disabled people. We don't read non-disabled accounts of disabled life because these accounts have so often gotten our stories wrong. When we think about autism, we don't consult the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, DSM, or ask autistic people's families about autism. We listen to autistic people themselves. And so now she's applying this disorientation concept to an actual classroom atmosphere where she's teaching her students how to understand disability first by centering the disabled voices themselves. And she lists, certain books that she would assign in that class that are written by disabled people and not the medical community, the DSM, not other medical texts that are continuing to reinforce stigma against these folks. So ultimately, this is to say disability is a social construct, a mismatch between the self and a world that was designed to cater to normative bodies and minds. Disability is a made-up category. Of course, this made-up category has real effects with enormous social, cultural, and personal significance and consequences. She's saying that there's such a huge array of disabilities and disabled bodies, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, visible, invisible disabilities. And so what is it that holds this diverse category together? What brings all these different types of bodies together? And she mentions that the wheelchair is the universal icon for disability. And so this particular mobility aid becomes the center visual device that constructs how we view disability as a culture. She mentions the social model of disability, which insists that disability is a social phenomenon. The problems are not in the bodies or minds of people, but in the stigma and barriers erected by society. What is this unifying central concept about able-bodied, able to do what? And so she's talking about how this is within the industrial societies, and this is really centering capitalism and work. So an able-bodied is a body that is physically able to show up to the factory and work. And so it's these kinds of normative expectations of what a body needs to do physically in order to provide labor for the capitalist. Within this disorientation chapter, she does, on page 24, take a historical detour, talking about colonialization, talking about slavery, and how disability concepts was also embedded within these historical cultures. For example, how the Christian churches and charity and missionary workers viewed and sought to cure disabled bodies. And within slavery, how the physical and mental conditions of a slave would affect their price at auction. So the category of disability, she states on page 25, the category of disability as a fundamentally economic judgment continued to be refined through the era of industrialization, when certain types of people, those who are not up for long hours standing at machines or doing small repetitive tasks, or deemed disabled. And indeed, what is the role of disability in having an official diagnosis in our current society today? But it is based on a financial need. And so one would need to define themselves officially with the state as disabled in order to get disability support from the government. And so therefore, by part of receiving this government support and being defined as disabled means that one can no longer work. And indeed, one is kept impoverished in the United States, especially because a disabled person is only allowed to have $2,000 worth of property or possessions in order to receive disability benefits, and therefore they also cannot work at the same time, and so they're kept in this state which ties disability to extreme poverty. And then continuing her very brief historical overview, she talks about the different words historically that were used to categorize disabled people, and many of those words are considered derogatory slurs to this day. And so just how disabled people were at the center of every social movement to get these words out of the vocabulary and also to gain rights with the government, as well as eventually getting the 1990 ADA passed, Americans with Disabilities Act. The disability rights movement really came out of the 1970s social justice movements, and they were really militant. They had the longest sit-in in an occupation of a federal building that has transpired by a social movement. A core team of disabled activists were really at the center for changing the laws and getting the government to recognize accessibility to education and employment. And so she's talking about, in our current era of disability social justice movements, that it's important to reclaim the word disability and to use that word and to center that word. And she's also talks about how the word CRIP has been reclaimed as more of a radical, critical disability studies word for the community that is also used. And she mentions, the film Crip Camp, the political activist and author Alice Wong, who really has brought this word to have a significant political meaning. And also part of this disorientation is just to really understand that the orientation and objective of this disabled body is not to be fixed or to try to get closer to that of a so assumed able body, but that it's fine. Disability is fine. Disability is here. That it's fine to accept people as they show up in this moment today, that they don't need to be fixed, they don't need technological advances, and that we as the society need to adapt and adjust to just allowing people to be as they are. Chapter 3, Scripts and Crips. In this chapter, she overviews media representation of the disabled body, and she talks about the symbols used in our society to understand disability and particular disabilities, and how disability intersects also with other marginalized identities and creates a stereotype for every particular identity or intersectional identities. She opens the chapter talking about Lynn Manning, who is a blind black man who is a Paralympian and a poet, who talks about the stereotypes that are associated with his embodiment as a black man, and then also as a blind man when he pulls out his white cane, and how the white canes, she states, are what many blind people use to navigate, but they also signal their disability to others. Once he unfolds that cane, people see him not as a black man, but as a blind black man with a whole new set of stereotypes and expectations. And she continues, being especially musical and good at the piano, being especially wise, and being pitied as a child who no one wanted, a burden to those around him. She's talking about the intersection of this particular stereotype as it's felt by one person in particular. And she says there's something to be said here about the lack of varied representation of disabled people, and especially about our invisibility when we don't fit a particular stereotype or narrative. And she talks about how these two people, Evans and Law, have been working on a project called Film Dis. They have tracked representation on TV of disabled people over various calendar years and written reports about disability and representation. So the media representation of disabled bodies are often, of course, written by able-bodied people and performed by able-bodied people and promoted by able-bodied people to represent a particular narrative that serves an ableist mentality and perspective. Who's creating this representation? Who's it for? And what power does it have in society? And she says that there's a set stereotypes are often expressed through tropes, repeated themes or motifs that appear in media. A set expectation of particular stereotypes that come to mind, not only in entertainment media, she says, but in science, engineering, medicine, education, and indeed all aspects of our social institutions. And so in this chapter then, she basically just goes through all these tropes that are used to represent disabled bodies within the media. So the first trope that she mentions is the pitiable freak. The pitiable freak trope appears across all kinds of media. It's tied to the history of freak shows and medical displays more generally, perhaps less obviously, but more perniciously, it underpins the marketing of many charitable campaigns. We think about the early 1900s and the freak show that actually put disabled bodies on display for entertainment in the carnival, and then to more contemporary charity movements that puts the disabled body on display in order to raise money for the organization. And in this particular example, she's calling out the organization Autism Speaks, which she states is a non-autistic-led group whose fundraisers first depicted autism as a sinister force in the world, something that breaks up homes and families, causing terrible fates for autistic people and those around them. She says this same trope has long been identified and critiqued in the older Muscular Dystrophy Association telethons, which featured comedian Jerry Lewis. Former poster children, literally what they were called and where that term comes from, were called Jerry's kids. And so they're talking about just the horrible fate that is suffered by these children in order basically to raise money for their company. The next category she talks about, she calls moochers and fakers. The moochers and fakers trope shows up in coverage about disability benefits or accommodations for disabled people, who are often portrayed as cheating and lying to get benefits that they don't deserve. So this trope also invites intrusion into one's medical privacy, and there's just this assumption that the disabled person is lying, they're faking it, that they don't deserve any accommodations, and so therefore they should really be analyzed in order to see if they really need this. And part of the scrutiny, she uses the example of people using the disabled parking spots. For disabled people who could be using those spots, many of them, she says, don't use these spots because they're afraid of the onlooker, the ableist gaze upon them, saying, why did you take that parking spot? Clearly you don't need it, you're not disabled, you're not using a mobility device. And so often people internalize the stigma associated with disability, and in particular using that parking spot. And so a lot of people just won't use that parking spot because they don't think they're disabled enough to use it, or they're afraid of this judgment. I definitely have seen that with my own father. He was in his 90s and using, a walker, and he still didn't want to use that spot because he didn't think it was for him. The next script she talks about is the bitter cripples, and she uses the example of Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump or Captain Hook in Peter Pan. Just that the disabled body is, of course, someone who's extremely angry about what happened, what their situation is, and that they're self-hating, basically. Just that this self-hatred and this situation is justified because within this trope and stereotype is the assumption that disabilities are thus sometimes used to signify internal moral or characterological disability. The disability seems to cause the villainy instead of reflect it. It's also assumed that disabled people who are cranky because they are disabled. This trope also has real-world implications of how people respond. And so she says that this trope keeps us from complaining about lack of access or inclusion, since we'll be dismissed as bitter, which lets non-disabled people off the hook from listening. And so by stereotyping disabled people as complaining about their situation, then by internalizing that stereotype, then people are going to not complain. They're going to be quiet about their needs and accessibility issues, and therefore continue to maintain this ableist status quo, rather than really demanding the accommodations that they should have to be a part of whatever social situation. And another aspect of this stereotype is just that characterizing disabled people as being ungrateful or not properly civil. And so when disabled people are frustrated or angry because of these barriers that they might face in the physical world, that they're falling into that trope then and are going to gain the reactions to that trope that's been kind of taught to us within these media images. This trope also means that disabled people often have to moderate or justify tone and approach to be good cripples in order to be treated with fairness. Recognize that this is also true for many other marginalized people, particularly Black women. And so just this tone policing that is also a part of this particular stereotype that we see in the media, and then has real world implications for how people are treated, how they internalize that they're going to be seen and read, and therefore moderating their own behaviors, which might continue to promote inaccessibility. So the next trope that she mentions in this chapter is called shameful sinners, which she defines as a long-running trope that frames disability as a punishment or penance for some kind of sinful action, either the mother's or the disabled person. We're all very familiar with this kind of stereotype in the media because it's like, the concept of like, what did I do to deserve this? Why am I being punished? Why is God punishing me? And always this kind of blame the mother trope that's larger than disability studies. We want to believe in a just world, and therefore if a person is disabled, they must have done something to cause this disability. Or else the world isn't just. How would this disability happen just to anyone randomly without a reason? She talks about religion, a literal judgment from God for the sin. And so a lot of cultures, a lot of religions, a lot of just long-term ideological concepts within our society or other societies attach disability to some kind of judgment. It could be a religious judgment. It could be being punished for, something you did in your past life. And in a lot of Asian cultures, they really blame the disabled person for their disability and think that there's a reason or a cause for that the person is cursed. The shameful sinners trope and stereotype that she's talking about in the media is definitely one that we can strongly recognize in the media and in our society as well. And then the final trope that she talks about is the inspirational overcomers. The inspirational overcomers trope might be the most common one in the media, and it deeply shapes our expectation for the normalization of disabled people's lives and abilities, all of which is bound up in our relationship to tech. So once someone becomes disabled, they have to use a technology adaptive device and run a marathon, just really overdo it and overcome. They're not going to be held back by their disability, but they're going to succeed and win and do these superhuman feats, and that they're going to be an inspiration. This is often called inspiration porn in the disability community. She says this trope implies that to be a good disabled people, we have to be constantly fighting against our bodies and minds in some ways, that you have to push it and always try to be achieving these superhuman feats. And the opposite of this is just to sit back and say, you know what? I don't want to do that stuff. I just want to, sit here and be at peace and not be constantly pushing myself in order to satisfy who? The ableist onlooker, the ableist viewpoint and perspective. Like, this is not coming from this disabled community. And so she talks again about how she teaches her technology and disability students to understand and how to center disability within the framework. And so she says, on the first day of class, my students get these messages: invert the social pressure for disabled people to be normal or inspirational or worthy. Care what disabled people say, do, and think. Don't be neutral. The neutral medical position on so many things has justified our exclusion and incarceration. And the neutral social view makes us into unfortunate charity cases rather than fully human. Try being biased not against but towards disabled people in how we frame issues and problems. This chapter, Scripts and Crips, provides a good overview of the most popular tropes and stereotypes of disabled people in the media. And so it's really helpful for us to recognize and label these stereotypes and tropes so that when we see it in the media, we can point at it, we can say there it is. And we can also dig deeper than that and understand, who wrote this? Who does this support? Promoting this kind of distorted imagery and stereotype in society into a public forum. Who does that serve? Does it serve, is it coming from the disabled community themselves? Is this the voice, the story, the narration that they want out there to be told? Or is it an ableist perspective that's being used in order to further marginalize and exclude disabled people in the disability community? So I think this chapter is really useful for us when we consume our media, and we're able, therefore, to be a lot more aware of these tropes that are put before us and to question them. So chapter 4 is called New Legs, Old Tricks. And it opens by saying 5 moments in becoming an amputee. And so now she's inviting us into her story from her perspective, and just the process of becoming a disabled person as someone who had previously researched science and technology, the new social interactions between engaging with her new disability and her new situation, and also just being on the receiving end of these ableist perspectives and comments. And I was thinking about this in relation to her previous chapter, where she said that, when the disabled person and the so defined able-bodied person first encounter each other, the able-bodied person has this question about the disabled body, and so either they say something rude and blatant, what happened, or else they're thinking it. How they look at the person is that they're wondering about the story behind the disability. And so now she's telling us this story, and it's just, like for us as the viewer, you might wonder, like, well, when is it appropriate to ask about the story? And so I think about that in relation to, my racial identity, for example. If someone wants to ask me what my racial identity is or what my racial background is, I would say just don't ask. It's not about you. Make the person feel comfortable, and if they bring it up naturally and authentically and want to share that with you, then you can be happy that you created a space for that and that you did get to learn that information. But the information, it's none of your business. That information is not for you until the person chooses of their own will to share that with you. And so then you've achieved that level of intimacy. And so I feel in this book, turning to chapter 4, now we've achieved that intimacy. Now she's going to share us her trajectory in these 5 points. And so it starts, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, liftoff. We're brought into her journey. And she starts with number 5. After my diagnosis and subsequent start to chemo, a friend brings our family dinner. I tell her I'm probably going to have my leg amputated, and she tells me to not think so negatively. But I can feel how big the tumor is if I run my hand along the side of my thigh above my knee. 4. Everyone who is non-disabled has optimistic things to say about how advanced prosthetics are now. It's reflexive. Me, I'm going to get an amputation. Them, prosthetics are so advanced now. It's like a memorized church call. It's the instant answer. It's the quick answer. So you can imagine that people that become amputees are just tracked and forced into that pathway. She says, 3, I interview prostheticists on the phone in weeks before my amp. I go with the one who has the most experience. 2, she's talking about she's lucky that she didn't break her leg on the pathway to discovering her cancer diagnosis, as so many others do. She dances with her kids as often as she can before the months before the amputation date. I savor all the last times with my leg and my full mobility. Section 1, I'm home recovering from my amputation a few weeks out. I'm learning how to do old things in new ways, in the process of learning how to use her mobility aids. And then she says, lift off. I have been interested in technology and disability for a long time, even before I knew I too would become an amputee. And so pulling on the last chapter about media and stereotypes and tropes, she talks about how she's entered into this community now, and she's put in that position of, the pressure of these stereotypes and tropes, that she should pursue technological advances in prosthetics technologies in order to make her body look as normative as possible. She talks about going back to school now that she's living as an amputee, and how it's a different experience now to navigate her way around campus and in the building that she teaches, the bathrooms. She talks in this section too about how when it comes to disability and technology, that the technology becomes the center character, and that the disabled person is just the background to the triumphant technology which saves this person, and that's the real hero. She was talking about in this chapter the role of technology as the hero in the disability story, and that actually adapting to these technologies is a process. And so for amputees, she says the majority of amputees are leg amputees versus arm amputees. And also the tools are very different for above the knee, below the knee, the hip, and so on. And for hands as well, she talks about how certain hands could be designed in a more useful way rather than looking, having 5 fingers and looking normative. The hands could be crafted in order to really provide the utility desired by the person. She talks about how babies, when they're born, are giving a hearing test, and either they pass or don't pass, and if they don't pass, they're tracked in this particular way for the considerations of a cochlear implant. And also the ways in which the deaf community resists this tracking, don't necessarily feel the need for these technologies in every cases, and indeed relish the times when they can take off their hearing aids and to, enjoy the peace that comes with not hearing. And so she talks about just the flip side of the benefits of disability. And so, shifting our perspective and thinking about, Goffman's stigma and Howard Becker's outsiders, rather than saying, viewing the disabled body from this ableist perspective of saying, what can we do? How can that body be adapted to look and function in an ableist normative manner? What are the benefits of particular disabilities? And so she talks about, on page 73, some people in deaf studies talk about deaf gain in opposition to hearing loss, to refer to the benefits of being deaf and what they have gained from both deaf community and from not being able to hear. So we only see ever the ableist perspective. And so, for example, in my own personal experience, when my father was suffering severe hearing loss, and I took him to be fitted for a hearing aid, and when the technician put the hearing aid on my father, he could hear perfectly, and it was like we went back in time 5 years, and that we were just having a normal conversation rather than the struggle which our communication had evolved into because of his hearing loss. And so it was like, wow, I told him, I said, wow, it's like just talking to my old dad again, like this is amazing. And so to me, it's assumed that we'll get these hearing aids. It doesn't matter that they cost $5,000. They can bring him back to behaving more normally. My dad hated the hearing aids. He didn't want them. He didn't have the dexterity in his hands to put them in, so that caused him a lot of stress. And then it completely stressed him out to know that this stuff cost $5,000, and it was this little tiny thing that could just fall on the ground and he could lose it instantly. So he said if he's going to get a hearing aid, he's not going to leave his room while wearing it. And to me, it's like, that's the whole point, Dad, is to wear it when you're out so that you can function and you can hear people. And so ultimately he returned the hearing aids. He didn't want anything to do with them. My brother bought him, a pair of $100 just amplifiers, and he used that when my sister absolutely forced him to. So the point is he didn't want to wear hearing aids. And to me, as his child, it's like, don't you want to talk to your children? Don't you want to hear your children? The hard truth is that he didn't choose to use these technologies. He didn't find it useful to him, and he probably enjoyed being able to just not have to engage in conversation with people, and just to be able to watch TV and turn up the volume there and get that pleasure. So just to show and demonstrate what it looks like when we center what the person wants themselves and what they're asking for, rather than even what the family is asking for and able to engage with their loved one. And so in conclusion of this chapter, which is subheaded 0, she says, I'm an amputee, no longer becoming, but being. My spouse has learned all the ins and outs of our insurance network plans. That's the painful part. And then, she's planning on getting her prosthetic leg, and that she'll start breaking them in and now have, just this one more tool in the toolbox, but it's not always required, that she can change that out for her rollator or using a wheelchair device. So just, this chapter really shows the process of becoming, engaging with one's own body's changes, engaging with the medical establishment, engaging with even one's own friends and loved ones about their ableist presumptions now pushed onto you, and the disabled person. And for the author to just come into her own and understand like this new world, this new subculture that she's entering into, and just the radical process of trying to think for herself what her own needs are and not the needs even of her family and her spouse and her insurance company and her employer and the physical society around her, but to center her own being in this process. So, interesting, great chapter. Chapter 5 is called The Neurodivergent Resistance. And she opens by saying this chapter is, quote, outside my lane. I'm not autistic, but I'm writing here about techniques and technologies for autism specifically and about neurodivergence more broadly. And so this chapter also just brings attention and focus to neurodivergence, to mental health issues, and talks about historically in the disabilities community and the disability rights movement, there's been this focus and centrality of those who use mobility devices, and especially visual disabilities, physical disabilities. And so often mental health issues have been bracketed off and treated differently. And so part of the intersectionality and part of the broad spectrum of what makes up the vastness of the disability community highlights different specific aspects of disability and specific needs, barriers, and accessible transformations. And so she herself is talking about someone who uses mobility devices and talking about approaching her campus and the physical space and now encountering these physical barriers to access. And so she's shifting our focus now into those in which the current literature calls autism spectrum disorder, and centering some of the issues around these particular disorders. She also points out that Asperger's syndrome is a label that is no longer used diagnostically, although it's still in use in our society. Hans Asperger, after whom it was named, was a Nazi collaborator. He sentenced most people he identified as autistic to death or institutionalization, selecting only certain specific types of autistic people, those who presented with what would later be called Asperger's, as worth saving, as real citizens, because they could contribute to society. And so she says when we start to focus specifically on the historical treatment of autistic people, it's filled with brutality and misunderstanding. She's contextualizing neurodivergence and neurodiversity within the social model of disability. Ideas like neurodivergence and neurodiversity build on the social rather than the medical model of disability, and they allow people to talk about different types of neurodivergence precisely as disabilities. And so she's just talking about the range of outcomes for neurodiversity, for neurotypical people, and just some of the specific issues that folks might struggle with as far as expected social engagement, compliance with social norms. She says, as we saw with prosthetic hands, compliance with social norms is usually intended for the comfort of the non-disabled. And so the autistic person then is pushed into this track where they have to behave in a way that makes the neurotypical people feel at ease. And so she uses the example of eye contact and how eye contact might make some folks uncomfortable, but it's a practice that provides comfort to this ableist perspective. She talks about in this chapter how social structures can significantly improve the lives of disabled neurodivergent groups, and she provides a list of examples of social accommodations that could be helpful. When expectations are clear, flexible, and varied to meet different needs, fluorescent lights are not used, attention to sound, white noise, noise dampening headphones, fidget spinners, fidget toys, when deadlines are flexible, elevators, when food is labeled clearly, providing more opportunities for people to sit down and rest, more seating options, more captioning and image descriptions for live events, gender-inclusive bathrooms, and the ability to go off Zoom camera. So there's just a long list of accommodations in both the physical world and in the work world and the work interactions expected that can be altered to accommodate different people. And she talks about just this dark eugenics history and its relationship to neurodivergency and mental health. and just the list of therapies that have been used historically who have neurodivergencies. And she also talks about this higher rate among autistic people are far more likely to be transgender or non-binary and to classify themselves as queer in some way. Connection between autism and gender nonconformity or variance makes a lot of sense. Another intersection of understanding autism and potential intersections with LGBTQ identities. And so I'm sure she also wanted to include this chapter just so that we really do have a focus not only on physical disabilities, but on mental health and neurodivergencies and the ways in which entering those particular folks can provide more insights into the range of accommodations, the ways in which we can transform our society, incorporating these different perspectives. Chapter 6 is called Accessible Futures, and she opens with the subheading, "The future is disabled." Techno-futurists want to believe that in the future utopia there will be no disability. But in reality, she goes on to say, we should expect both more ways to be disabled and more people existing with disability. The future is disabled. This is a tagline of the Disability Visibility Project. Disability is different than gender or race, these assumed to be stable categories over one's life. But disability is something that can impact absolutely any body, and certainly given enough time, it absolutely will affect everybody. And so she's saying the techno-futurists feel that whatever problem that we encounter in the future, there will be a technology to counteract that. But in reality, just as our planet evolves in however it's going to evolve with more of an unstable atmosphere, we're going to have more unstable bodies and disabilities in the future. And so rather than fight against that, rather than to try to constantly come up with new technologies, the first step is to center those bodies, to appreciate those experiences, and see how we can incorporate that into a society that values all bodies and all perspectives in order to make our society more accessible and reactive towards more people. She's talking about the future of the environment, all of the ways in which future climate catastrophes is going to affect our human bodies. She talks about pollution is increasing, the rates of environmentally produced disease and disability. So we have pollution and those kinds of impacts on human bodies, changing weather patterns, natural disasters. Our ability to just grow food and have a stable food source is reliant on a stable climate. And so any kind of issues of food deserts, of inaccessibility to food production is a factor in future disabilities. The future is disabled through new and emerging diseases. As we saw with COVID-19, we can have new types of pandemics in the future as, our environment becomes more unstable. The future is disabled cosmically. Space as an environment is not suited to any human bodies. And so just this techno-futurist fantasy that we can escape our planet and go to another one is just not the reality of what our human bodies need. And also just talking about the process of disability, becoming disabled, just the perspective that gives on understanding life and social trajectories, and how we can adapt to uncertainty. She says disabled people know a lot about uncertainty, to disruption of plans that can send you towards a meltdown. For disabled people, they're used to living with uncertainty, with disruption. And so those are also concepts that society can incorporate in order to be more flexible and adaptable, not just to disabled people, but incorporating these kinds of accessibilities are helpful to everyone. And so we can really learn a lot, and it's an honor to be able to center these kinds of disability experiences, embodiments, and perspectives when we think about whatever kinds of projects we're working on as sociologists. Maybe we're thinking about social policy, city planners, transportation planners, whatever it is that you're interested in pursuing as a career. Incorporating the perspective of disabilities would be central to being the most accommodating you can be in whatever policy or built environment that you might be involved in. And so, for example, for me as a professor, it's good for me to think about these things when I'm working with students. There might be 25 students in a classroom. Some of them have different kinds of needs and accessibilities desired. that I should be prepared for. So ultimately, this final chapter is really talking about accessible futures, what disability and a perspective rooted in the embodied experience of disability can provide to all aspects of our society, and indeed ways in which disabled bodies might be more suited to certain types of situations. She says towards the end of this chapter, hearing stories from others' perspectives is fundamental to preparing for uncertain futures and to have imagination about how the world could be and could be different. Such stories should galvanize how we consider the future. So when we think about the future, the instability of the economic workplace, the educational system, of the medical institution, of our future climate on Earth, we should really incorporate these perspectives that are rooted in an actual experience of disability and incorporate that in everything that we build in our society so that we're not continuing these exclusions. This only benefits and broadens our own perspectives. These kinds of perspectives are helpful to all of us. So I really think that disability studies is on the cutting edge of critical cultural theory, and it's really just great to dig into these types of books, to read about specific disabilities and just the insights that all of us can have as a takeaway from these experiences. Because we all have bodies, we all have body issues, and our bodies also change over time. So thanks for listening. Thanks for joining me with this book. I wonder, what your experiences are with disability, with body changes, and especially centering, that perspective and encountering perhaps for the first time this kind of normative pushback from an ableist perspective that maybe you didn't expect because it's someone that's close to you, it's your family or friend. Let me know if you've read any books in the area of critical disability studies and what I should read next. Thanks.